In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Turquoise. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. When I was young, I hated olives. But at some point, they seemed like they were in everything in every restaurant. So when I was in the Marines at one point, I started eating an olive every day at lunch before I ate my food to get me used to them so that I could enjoy other stuff at restaurants. And I built a palate tolerance for olives. And I think that's what's happened with turquoise. It's not a color that I've really gone for in the past, but I do find myself more and more enjoying turquoise inks as I've used a ton of them. I find a common description I might use is refreshing. But that's what this tone is, refreshing. It should be used on a Florida summer day because it feels cool to look at, making the heat a bit more bearable. Now, this particular turquoise, it's fairly consistent in its tone. You're not going to get a lot of tone variation from pen to pen. And there is almost no shading, though you can get it. Still a refreshing, enjoyable tone. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Diplomat Aero with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, and you definitely see what I'm talking about with this being refreshing. Now, we get no feather, we get no spread, we get almost no shade. Really, there's only a few spots that seem to come in a little bit darker. The E in supposed on the top line does it. The HE on the third line of the does it, or the on the third line. I guess it depends on how you'd like to say it. It can shade. It will from time to time under the right circumstances, but don't count on it. Count on this tone that is absolutely nice to use. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than we had with the fine. And that little bit darker really does a lot for it. Right at the beginning, you see the word answer on, and compare that to what you saw with the fine directly above it. Nice. Now, there's no feather, there's no spread. There is some shading that's showing up with this medium, and when it shows up, it looks especially nice. Look at the first few words on the second line, or the last word on the second line. When it shows up, it looks really good. It's just not common. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone that a majority of that medium is. We get no feather, we get no spread, we do get a few spots of shading. What we get is to really soak in this beautiful tone as that stub nib, putting it down in the wider line, really makes this pop and feel nice. I want to use this ink while drinking iced tea in the sun. It's just heat defying. Looking at the back of the page, you see that this ink is well behaved. It's not bleeding through. It's not got any ghosting. Easily writing on the back. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Pilot Metropolitan with a fine nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a medium nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a 1.0 stub, The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get about the same tone, maybe a tad bit lighter than we had with the Clairfontaine. We don't get any feathering, we don't get any spread, we don't get any shading. Now I'm going to say that, but on the fourth line, when I get to the word sequence, when I had to back up when I made a mistake, we do see that it does get darker when you back up over areas like that. So it can, it's just not in normal writing. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. We get very light feathering happening, unfortunately, but it is there, and it is fairly consistent. Though this is not paper for fountain pens, the feathering that's going, I don't think is so distracting that you wouldn't use it and it's the end of the world. Just, I wouldn't. It's not spreading, it's not shading, it's a beautiful tone on the page. I wouldn't use it because of that feathering. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the medium. We get less feathering, a lot less feathering. In fact, it only feathers the tiniest little bit in certain areas. You do see it some on the B of B on the top line or the second D of added. It's there when you go searching for it if you really want to nitpick. It doesn't spread, it doesn't shade, it looks really good. I think this is working really well with the stub. Looking at the back of the page, you see that a lot on the medium and the stub, it really got deeper into the page. So you couldn't write on the back of the page, but it never bled through and touched the page underneath. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the fine nib, the most noticeable thing first is the tone change. It certainly goes a little bit more teal leaning in this turquoise. It's got a little bit more of the green really coming out because of the tone of the paper. But with that, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading, but it's definitely there. Not that I think you would use this turquoise in a professional environment, but this is something to consider when you're looking at it. Looking at the medium nib, it is a tad bit darker than we had with the fine. Similar problem here as the last paper is we do get a little bit of feathering and it's fairly consistent. But the feathering I think is smaller than the last paper. It's less distracting. I think you could use this without any kind of real problem. We're not getting any kind of spread, so there's nothing going on there. And there's really no shading happening at all. It's just a neat tone, not the same tone as we had with the Clairfontaine at all. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone as the medium. It does feather about as much as the medium. It doesn't seem to have any spread. It does seem to have some spots of shading. Now, when you look at the Q and quill, you'll see a darker area right before I head off to the U. You will see pens starts a little darker, gets a little lighter at the E and darker at the end, so it can, and it is coming through here a little bit. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that the ink got deeper into the page. It did not bleed through and touch the page underneath. You, depending on your opinion on it, could probably use the back of the page though.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it.
And here we see the results of the resistance test.
The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we see this is much more of that green-leaning turquoise still from the tone of the paper. But its performance on this paper is pretty darn good. With the fine, we get no feather, we get no spread. We do see some spots of shading that are going to occur quite a bit throughout this writing, more than we got on the other Steno pads, so it's very nice to see it happen. I always like seeing shading get to come through on cheaper paper or non-fountain pen paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than we had with the fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Not that that's really a problem. There's a significant price difference between these two. I kind of wish that they made this paper a little closer to white, because this ink is doing very nice. I think it looks very nice. I just don't tend to use greens on the Stenos. And this is a turquoise that's become very green-leaning. Looking at the stub nib, we see the same tone that we had with the medium. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is giving some shading. Now, the shading, when it is occurring, it is very nice. Look at the top line, likely. Starts lighter, gets darker, goes lighter in the E, darker in the L, lighter out of the Y. Why? Because this ink is so nice to look at, even when it's not exactly the tone that it gives on white paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the ghosting is fairly under control. You could probably use the back of the page with no problems, and there's no bleeding at all.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Diamine Havasu Turquoise. Here is Noodler's Navajo Turquoise. Here is Pilot Mixable Turquoise. Here is Robert Oster Tranquility.
The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook.
Looking at the fine nib, we get about the same tone that we've had on the last couple papers. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get a couple of moments where shading does come through, always a surprise and always a pleasant one, unless it bleeds. But this paper's not really known for bleeding a whole lot, at least with me. I'm going to say it's fairly nice, but don't expect it to be giving a ton of shading, because as you're watching, you only see a few spots where it happens. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is giving a little bit more shading than we had with the fine. It's not drastic in the amount of shading, but look at the B and the T of obstacle. Look at the E of obstacle. Very nice. In lantern on the second line, look at the L and the T. Look at the T and out on that second line. So it's definitely showing up with the shading. It's here to play the game. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the medium. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is, yes, It's shading technically, like I can go point out some spots to you where it's a little bit darker, but I'm not seeing this so much for the shading. I'm seeing this as really giving me the most of this nice tone on the paper. Do I wish it was more of the tone that I had with the Clairfontaine? Yes, and I should probably use a white paper if that's what I'm after. But I think what we're getting here is still very nice, still refreshing. Looking at the back of the page, we see that there's no bleeding, because there's almost no ghosting, because this paper is doing great and the ink, fantastic.
While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page.
Here's an orange ink by Diatramentis, their Michelangelo or ochre yellow. Here is a purple ink by Diamine, their Damson. Here is a black ink by Colorverse, Black Hole. Here is a red ink by Diamine, their Red Dragon.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the fine nib, we see the same kind of tone. It's weird how the 20-pound paper does it. It is coming a little bit more towards the turquoise, but it's still kind of having that green lean in it. Now, it does feather a tiny bit, but not the kind of feathering that should stop you from using this paper. It does have the tiniest bit of spread in certain areas, but not consistently. It's just kind of there. It does not shade, but I think it's doing fairly well. Looking at the medium nib, we get the same tone that we had with the fine. We still get some feathering, fairly consistent, tiny feathers all over the writing. Not in itself a problem. Does it spread just the tiniest bit? Still not a problem. Does it shade? No, it doesn't, which is a good thing for us on this paper because it means we're probably not going to bleed. We get to find out in about 30 seconds. Looking at the stub nib, we see the same tone that we had with the medium and the fine. We do see some tiny feathering going on, not the end of the world. We do see some tiny spread going on, not the end of the world. This is copy paper. We don't see any shading, more good signs, and we're getting ready to see the back of the page, and man, I'm hoping this works well. Looking at the page underneath, there was a couple of dots with the medium and the stub that it bled through. Wah, wah, sorry. But looking at the back of the page, you can see why. There's ghosting. You can't write back there. Use a fine nib on this paper.
So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
Choosing a pen here is one of these things, since it is the tone and not the shading to go after. I like a medium or wet broad or a stub to see as much of this beautiful tone. Refreshing is the word. Yes, I want to see more of it on the page, so I want a larger nib for that reason. In fact, it makes me kind of wish I had used the Pelican Double Broad just to be able to see it, even though I don't write on these smaller notebooks very well with it. I think it would have looked so good.
I hope you got something out of this video, and if it leads to you wanting to try this ink, when you purchase it, let the retailer know where you heard about it, whether it's me or any other channel. Thanks for watching.